Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
President Roosevelt went on to say, "With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounded determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph." That inevitable triumph started with the daring attack on the Japanese homeland in what has become known as the Doolittle Raid. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led the first innovative high-risk airstrike on Japan on April 18, 1942. He thought that the mission had ended in tragedy because he initially didn't know the fate of the crews and their planes, but in reality it was a great triumph. The Japanese had been dominating the Pacific War until the Doolittle Raid gave the United States retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor and a needed morale boost. The raid tactically utilized the aircraft carrier, reinforcing its significance as the crucial weapon in the Pacific War. There were many things that caused the Doolittle Raid. One of the major reasons was the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted revenge on Japan for attacking the United States without first declaring war. Roosevelt was adamant that he wanted to strike back at Japan at the earliest possible moment. However, due to Japan's strategic location, they thought they were invincible to attack, and the Americans thought that an attack on the homeland was impossible. Another reason was at the time, American morale was hurting badly.
That the United States had suffered a succession of defeats in the Pacific. Guam, the Philippines, Bataan, Corregidor, Wake Island. It was like a team that hasn't won a game in 2 years. America was desperate for a victory.
Roosevelt and the U.S. military needed a triumph to regain public confidence that the Axis powers could be stopped. Then, like a candle in the darkness, naval officer Francis Lowe came up with a novel idea that could give the U.S. a triumph. Lowe said, "I saw the outline of a carrier deck painted on an airfield where pilots are trained in carrier takeoffs and landings. I thought that if the Army has some twin-engine bombers with a range greater than Navy fighters, a few of them could be loaded on a carrier and used to bomb Japan." Immediately, the idea was approved. They planned for 16 Army bombers to be loaded onto an aircraft carrier. The carrier would bring them within 400 miles of Japan. After launch, they would bomb strategic targets and fly to a landing site in Asia. Military and political leader Chiang Kai-shek reluctantly gave the U.S. permission to use Chinese landing sites, for he was fearful of tragic Japanese retaliation. The planners then decided to use the B-25B Mitchell bombers.
We took everything out of them that wasn't necessary, stripped them down to where they were as light as we could get them, and filled them full of extra tanks so we could have enough gasoline to get to China. So we were able to fly. I flew about 16 hours, almost 16 hours in that day, and the airplane was only designed to fly 4.
The aircraft carrier Hornet, fully loaded with 16 B-25s in her defense ships, set sail from San Francisco on April 2, 1942. They then steamed their way towards the Japanese home islands. If the task force was detected and attacked, they could tragically lose half of the Pacific Fleet. On April 18, 1942, when the task force was about 250 miles from the intended launch point, they were sighted by a Japanese patrol boat. They sunk the boat, but the risk to travel further was too great. The decision was made for the bombers to launch early. The crews were nervous of tragedy. They were doubtful they had enough fuel to get them to the planned landing sites in China. Plane 1, piloted by Doolittle, rumbled down the deck and successfully took off.
Well, we were real happy. I was in plane number 9. And we saw 8 planes successfully take off ahead of us. And each plane that took off made us feel a little better. We were pretty confident by the time it was our turn.
It was a triumph that all planes launched successfully. To conserve fuel, the bombers slowly slugged their way to Japan. They flew just above the waves to avoid radar detection. After receiving very little anti-aircraft fire, the bombers triumphantly dropped their bombs on their targets. They targeted war factories, public utilities, and military bases, thereupon setting a course for China. There was a bad storm making the navigation of the bombers almost impossible. The wind, which usually swept from east to west, changed direction and now was miraculously giving them a tailwind, pushing them into China.
Most of us just flew on in until we ran out of fuel and then jumped out of our airplanes and glided down in our parachutes to China.
The men then sought the help of locals and were smuggled to safety. Tragically, not all of the crew members made it to safety. 2 crew members drowned when their plane landed in the water. 1 man's parachute failed to open, and 8 fell into the hands of the Japanese and were immediately taken as prisoners of war. 3 of the men were tragically executed for hitting non-military targets. 1 man also died of malnutrition in prison. A total of only 7 men out of the 80 on the mission were killed. Doolittle thought that the mission had ended in tragedy, for they lost every plane, but he was promoted 2 ranks to the rank of Brigadier General and received the Congressional Medal of Honor. When giving Jimmy the medal, President Roosevelt said, "Jimmy, I'm proud of you. All of America is proud of you." Doolittle wrote to the commanding general of the Army Air Forces in his follow-up report on the raid. It was hoped that the damage done would be both material and psychological. Material damage was to be the destruction of specific targets. The psychological results, it was hoped, would be the recalling of combat equipment from other theaters for home defense, thus affecting relief in those theaters. The development of a fear complex in Japan, improved relationships with our allies, and a favorable reaction on the American people.
The raid itself was a triumph because the American morale had been so low at the time of the Doolittle raid that immediately morale in this country jumped to an unknown super high. The fact that we were actually able to hit the Japanese homeland.
This raid triumphantly did exactly what it was meant to do.
Roughly 4 months after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, we were over Tokyo bombing them. So it was, of course, we only had 16 planes, each with a ton of bombs. So it wasn't a great deal of damage to the Japanese Empire, but it shook them up.
The raid changed the way the Japanese fought the war. It forced the Japanese to divert their military resources from further conquest to attacking the United States Pacific Fleet and defending the home islands. They brought units from their army and navy to protect Japan from future attacks. Admiral Yamamoto, who had led the raid on Pearl Harbor, was particularly stricken by this loss. Immediately after the attack on Tokyo, he won the approval to send out a massive force to take the island of Midway. The Japanese thought they could destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers if they lured them into a battle. The U.S. had broken the code Japan used in the Pacific and were aware ahead of time of this invasion. The U.S. set up a surprise attack on the Japanese force. Though outnumbered and outmatched, the U.S. was able to claim a triumphant victory at Midway. Doolittle's triumphant raid on Tokyo led to Japan losing 4 of their 6 major aircraft carriers at Midway. This loss of the strategic weapon shattered their offensive abilities, turning the tide of the war. Balancing the triumphs was the tragic retaliation Japan took on China.
I must say that the Japanese came into China after we left and scourged the place, killed people by the thousands for what we done to the Japanese. They suffered.
As Chiang Kai-shek had feared, the Japanese soldiers raped and killed 250,000 innocent Chinese civilians. 4 years after President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech, where he claimed an inevitable triumph against the Japanese, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to the Allies. Today, we live free of tyranny, but many do not know about the seemingly small triumphs that truly make heroes and change the course of history. Triumphs like Doolittle's raid on Tokyo that balanced on the possibility of tragedy can turn the tide of a war.